welcome everyone. One of the cultures of the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association is we honor people's time. So we start on time and we end on time. That's our promise to you. If you hang out after that, that's on you. So I'm Mary Eisenstein and I welcome you all here today. Before we hear from our panel, the overview for today, what triggered today's meeting is the meeting that we had on January 30th, where the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association invited in the developer for the property on Capital One. And as you know, it was jam-packed in here, cheek to jowl. So the question, of course, is you hear that information, now you have that information, but then what do you do with that information? And that's why we, the Civic, have this meeting today, is to bring to you citizen tools that you now can use as a follow-up to that information. So that's the general idea for today. And it's going to be in different sections. You are going to hear from the people on the panel, and everything is relevant to what we're going to do. Then we're going to talk about the tools, and you're going to get handouts. And then the last segment of the meeting, we want to hear from you, and we're going to have a short breakout session. So, without further ado, first I would like to introduce two of the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association board members, Jean Swybish and Katie Girondello, who did a lot of work to bring this meeting to fruition today. So please give them a round of applause. And we all know it takes a team. It takes a team. And the other is, I know some of you were at the meeting on January 30th. And as you can see, your Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association really puts a lot of thought and to honor our mission statement, to inform and educate our community, which is what we're doing. So we encourage you to become members and be a part of a voice for your community. So without further ado, our first guest, his name is Eric Sepenowski. And Eric and I were having a conversation one day, and it got to speaking about property rights and the common good. And I fell in love with him. The language that he used, the way he described it, and we all know when you're in the company of someone special. Well, I'd like you to give a warm welcome to farmer and trustee of Southold Town, Mr. Eric Sepenowski.
I'd like to begin today's forum by thanking Mary Eisenstein, Bob DeLuca, and the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association for organizing our gathering. I also extend my gratitude to the Mattituck-Laurel branch of our public library network. It is fitting that we should be here in this space dedicated to advancing public literacy and sharing of knowledge for human flourishing in a healthful community. I could think of no better space than a public library in which to discuss the recent amendment to the New York State Constitution and to familiarize ourselves with the tools for generating robust public comment on projects of potentially great and lasting environmental and social impact. I've been asked here to speak briefly about land. As a fellow farmer, I am honored by this opportunity to proceed Legislator Krupski with my comments and sensing that he will address ongoing farmland preservation efforts, I'll focus my remarks on how land implicates us in a shared sense of place and public purpose. I speak about land and place having been born into a Polish-American farming family. Our history with this land is just reaching 5 generations deep, admittedly shallow by North Fork English family standards. And believe me, they let you know that you're a newcomer. As a child, I sensed that I was living through a great transition time. Farms, including ours, were shrinking. Land was going fallow. Land was being subdivided and developed, built to suit. And mercifully, some land was being preserved. These changes to the land meant changes in how I experienced the contours of the physical and social worlds I inhabited. The place I lived was not given, fixed, and immutable, but ever-changing. I listened to the people around me talk about how this place was changing, and they were being pushed out and aside, displaced, as it were, by development, demographics, and big money. They lamented the slow erasure of the social worlds they knew. This all had the effect of convincing me that whenever something is done to the land, the effects ripple outwards, initiating shifts in our local ecology, and in turn affect our psychology. These shifts have a bearing on the ways we make and share meanings about place and how we imagine and enact our identities. As Leslie Keynes Weissman has written, we simply do not know who we are until we know where we are. Indeed, where would we be, who would we be, if we did not have the land? Hearing such local talk affected me profoundly. On the one hand, I could understand the tendency to slip into stories of powerlessness and fatalism, the feeling that certain things are inevitable. Nothing can be done to stop the loss in the name of progress. On the other hand, I sensed there could be power in the stories we tell ourselves and others about the places we live. Stories have a navigational quality to them, and when we tell them right, they can function like trim tabs, steering the ship subtly but surely in the direction of sustainability and resilience. Many people learn to tell stories in which they weren't the victims of change, they had agency, and when they moved beyond their private and personal spheres to create for themselves public subjectivities, they could affect change by articulating a positive vision of the future, and that vision work remains ours to carry out. We must intelligently guide what is done with and to the land, knowing that by extension it will be done, something done to us. Today there are several ambitious projects in the works that call on each of us to participate in the process of deciding whether, where, and how they should take place. What is their appropriate scale? How will they affect our mobility, our ability to move about town? Will these projects contribute to community in ways that teach us how to inhabit and root in this place? Or will they teach us to temporarily reside here, to be transient and rootless? I argue the most important questions will be the ones that touch on resource use. To what extent does resource consumption exceed what ecologists call the carrying capacity of the land? The lives, the land, the aquifer, and the sea will sustain indefinitely if we use resources responsibly. To Mary's point, to do this work, we must recognize the affordances and limitations of land ownership. From ownership flow the rights of citizenship and enfranchisement in this nation. To own real estate is to exert a powerful claim to belonging here and have a voice in the public square. But while ownership confers certain rights to the landowner, it says nothing of the responsibilities to steward the land or how to be neighborly. Responsibilities are different from rights. Unlike rights, which flow as if automatically from legal mechanisms and are backed by state power, responsibilities seem optional. They must be taught, studied, learned, and continually practiced in relation to others. It is not realistic to expect landowners to know how to practice their responsibilities to the land and to the community. It is up to all of us to find and use language to express what is wise use of land, water, and air. This work will be difficult, no less so because it will be messy at times, and it will require us to recognize that this work does not begin and end with us. We are in the middle of a much larger story of changes to land and community. To end, I want to share the work of sociologist and peace scholar Elise Boulding. I find her words appropriate to the efforts we'll be undertaking today. Boulding spoke about the perspective that opens up when we feel we are inhabiting a 200-year present. The beginning of this present starts with the birth of the oldest person you knew when you were a child, and it extends into the future to the 100th birthday of the youngest person you have held in your arms. The span of time is roughly 200 years. The decisions we make today are linked to the lives and works of those who come before us, and what we do today will have the effect of creating and shaping the world of those who inhabit this land after us. So now, the summary of the struggle. I want to turn us over to the tools.
Thank you, Eric, so very much for framing what we're doing. So our next special guest is also a farmer and our county legislator, and also a great supporter of the civic associations throughout the town. Please give a warm welcome to Al Krupski.
After what Eric said, I really don't want to be the next speaker. I tell you, I have to say that I'm very encouraged to hear that kind of message. So thank you, Eric. That was really
Thank you, Al.
that was excellent and well timed for the times that we live in. Thank you very much to the Mattituck-Laurel Civic. Really, this is so important. As an elected official, I've been elected official since 1985. I can tell you that to get that kind of input from the community is critical, because you only know what you know in life. You really, and so to get input from everybody who lives in town, every stakeholder, everyone from every walk of life with all of their life experiences is really important. So thank you. So I've been asked to speak about the importance of farmland preservation, and I'll start with the county's program. So the county had the first farmland preservation program in the country starting in the mid-'70s. They realized that the farmland, the really super productive farmland on Long Island, because of our climate, because of our great soils, but it was getting paved over. And it was hundreds of thousands of acres of active farmland, to Eric's point, of only a generation ago on Long Island. And that quickly, it had been paved over, and you don't have to drive very far west to see the result of that. It's really shocking how fast it can happen to a community. So the county, in its wisdom, in the mid-'70s said we need, John Klein was the county executive, we need a farmland preservation program. When you preserve land for open space, which I'm a big advocate for, have open spaces, whether it's for beach access or for habitat or just places for people to go, it's really important. And then it's a responsibility of the municipality, whatever it is, whether it's village, town, county, or state, to manage that land for the people. And whatever, you're going to have baseball fields, or you're going to have walking trails, or anything in between. When you preserve farmland, the land stays on the tax rolls. It's managed by the private property owner, so it's not the responsibility of the municipality. It's still in private, held privately. The land still is habitat for many different things, and we have a lot of, in farming, we have a lot of good partners for agriculture, to support agriculture. I'm on the board of directors of the Suffolk County Soil and Water Conservation District. So we try to do things that improve soil health. One of our partners is Cornell Cooperative Extension. We have a lot of good scientists there that help agriculture try to improve soil health and improve their practices. So when you preserve farmland, it's the physical farmland, and to Eric's point, again, it's an opportunity to pass that along. It's kind of like your legacy. That land, especially if it's in a large block, can always be used for agriculture in some form in perpetuity. You also have watershed protection, because while farmers irrigate in the summer, all season long when it rains, you're gathering that rainwater and replenishing our aquifer. And there's no strain, of course, on public resources, because preserved farmland doesn't put children in school, it doesn't require fire and rescue services for the most part. So there's very little strain on public services. And if you look globally at our food situation here, you talk about food security. We need to have productive farmland everywhere in the country. It's not just you can't rely on the Midwest, you can't rely on Brazil, we really need to have food production locally. That's really important. And we don't know the changing nature of farming. It changed a lot in my lifetime. And when I see Eric, I always think of his father, because his parents are my generation. But you always think of the changing nature of agriculture, and we think, well, today it's this crop. Who knows what that's going to be in the next generation. So that's always in flux. So the county started the farmland preservation program for those reasons back in the mid-'70s, and then they had to fund it in some way. You need a funding source. You need two things to preserve farmland. You need, or open space. You need a voluntary seller, and you need a funding stream. Right? So the county set up a program to fund it. Now it's currently 0.25% of the sales tax goes towards that land preservation, but not the whole 0.25% goes towards land preservation. Some goes for water quality efforts, different programs. Some goes towards stabilizing sewer rates in Western Suffolk. And some goes into the general fund out of that 0.25%. What the county did after the bubble burst in 2007, 2008, or just before that, land prices were going up. They borrowed heavily against future revenues. So 2/3 of the money that's collected, that's dedicated for land preservation in the county, goes towards debt service, which really limits the amount of actual ready money for land preservation, and it's a huge county. And that's not just farmland preservation, it's also open space. So some of the more West End properties are extremely appraised higher, I don't know what's more valuable, but they're appraised a lot higher. And so if the money's there and we have a willing seller, we will buy that. Whether it's for a pocket park, whether it's for an isolated farmland piece on the West End, I always support those. And I always support land preservation on the West End also, because it's just as important in the west of Suffolk as it is on the East End. It's important throughout countywide. So, because there's a limited funding stream, if you have a landowner and they make the decision, we're going to preserve our land, this is their asset, this is their equity. They're ready to do something. They're going to get a check for what they're giving, the rights that they're giving up to preserve their land. They're going to retain the land. They're making a decision. A lot of it's based on estate planning. They have to make that decision. So at that point in time, how do you react to all that if you only have a small amount of money? So quite often in the last few years, as a county, I'm on the EPA committee, Environment, Planning and Agriculture Committee. We'll go into executive session, and recently we've had a list, open space and farmland. Okay, there's $20 million worth of asks. We have $8 million of cash, and how are we going to spend it? And then we have to figure out, try to prioritize. There's rating sheets. They're subjective. So I appealed to the county executive, and I appealed to the comptroller a couple of years ago. I said, look, we have an influx of federal money. The sales tax revenue in the county has really gone way up because of the pandemic. So We, the county, have been paying off old debt to the hundreds of millions of dollars in the last 2 years. I said, why don't we take that land preservation debt and pay that off so we'll have the full amount that's collected dedicated towards land preservation. The best we could do in the end was to, county executive made a commitment to bond $100 million for farmland preservation, which in money's money, so it frees up the remaining money stream for open space and everything else. But the problem is there's $10 million a year put into the capital budget. And I chaired the capital budget program in the county. Suffolk County normally borrowed about $100 million a year. We tried not to go over that for all kinds of different road works and different capital improvements in buildings within the county. And that was a pretty normal program. So the proposal was to add $10 million a year just for farmland preservation. Well, that has to be put in the capital budget every year now. And then we have to vote to appropriate it every year. So the $10 million, I think there's probably enough, because we have our ear to the ground. Most of the farmland that's preserved in Suffolk County is preserved in Southold and Riverhead towns. And all the planning studies really strongly support preserving as much farmland in Southold and Riverhead towns. So that's really clear. They understand the value of preserving farmland. So the reason I came to the Civic, and thank you so much for letting me speak, because you've got a really great panel, and I don't want to take too much time away from what they're going to say, is that if I could get any kind of support, the resolution to appropriate that $10 million has been laid on the table by Economic Development and Planning, and it's going to be tabled at the committee. The committees are in Riverhead in March, and no, at the end of this month. The committees are in Riverhead, so if anybody could come and speak to the committee, committee's much more informal, so your voice is heard by that committee. And then we have to table it for the purpose of public hearing. The public hearing will be March, I think, 7th in Riverhead also. So anyone's welcome to come and speak, send letters, send emails to support, just to make sure that that $10 million is appropriated for farmland preservation. So that's my ask, and it's kind of a long story, but that's how. There's a lot of history involved with all these things, and it's important to have community support, because we have a county, so county legislature, the seal is a plow, and the seal of Suffolk County is a bull, two very strong agricultural symbols. So, you know, the history is there, but you have to keep, it's a constant struggle to try to, you know, maintain that. So thank you.
Some of the work that we're going to be doing here today is based on the comprehensive plan, Southold Town's comprehensive plan. And what's in this roadmap is what the citizens of this town have said they wanted. And to have Eric and Al here today, that is part of the culture of Southold Town. So we're going to move forward now to go back to the meeting on January 30th. There was an exchange between the developer and a participant in the audience. And after that, we got feedback that it was very confusing. So our next guest is going to address that, and you saw it on your agenda. Our next guest is the chair of the Zoning Board of Appeals. She is so committed to our community, and you just ask her to come to a meeting to explain something, and she's right there. There's one caveat here today, and that is Leslie will talk about the definition of terms that came up in the exchange, and do you all remember what the exchange was? Yes? So she'll clarify it, and if you recall, it had to do with a zoning situation between the developer and the person in the audience that was bringing it up. So, Leslie is not going to talk about the project itself, all right? She cannot do that, and she'll explain why. But she's going to give us some terms, and we're not going to take question and answers now. We're going to take questions and answers afterwards, so write down whatever you need. All right, so give a very warm welcome to Leslie Kane Wright.
I know almost everybody in the audience. It's pretty cool. I want to add my thanks to the library, to the civic associations, and I also want to add my thanks to all of you, because I was here that night to listen and to learn. We all live here, and that is what, at best, participatory democracy is about. Being engaged with matters of concern to our community. And so I thank all of you for your willingness to take the time to educate yourselves more and more about how we can best collectively address the matters that are before us. As Mary said, open meetings law bars me from really ever talking specifically about an application that is open before the board, same with planning board, unless it is at a duly legally noticed, publicly open meeting. That will happen on this project and all the others that come before the board. That is the appropriate place to listen, for me to ask questions, to answer questions, to gather data. It all becomes part of the public record that the zoning board uses to make its decisions. Okay. So specifically, I mean, I could talk for hours, as Mary knows, about zoning in general, but just briefly, the zoning board doesn't do zoning. So if you thought you were confused about terms, try that one. The town board is the legislative body, and the planning board works with the town board on the comprehensive plan. Those documents and processes are what create zoning districts. Now, I know Mary's got another one up her sleeve where you're going to look at what uses are permitted in what zone district, so I won't do that today. But I will try to clarify two terms that were bantered around and are confusing, frankly. They really are confusing. I don't know where those terms came from, but they're not very user-friendly. One is a special exception permit, also known in other municipalities as a special use permit, which doesn't help matters. But in our town, we call it a special exception permit. That is distinctly different from what we call a use variance. Okay? Very, very different standards, and I'll go over what those are. Town law, Consolidated New York State Town Law, what is it, 271B, addresses special use permits or special exception permits. It gives local municipalities the authority to essentially say, these uses are permitted in various zone districts. You can build a house in a residential neighborhood, okay? On the other hand, you cannot put a dry cleaner in a residential neighborhood, right? So this authority allows our town board to determine what uses are permitted, as we'll call as of right. In other words, you want to do something, you go in with your plans to the building department, you get a permit. That means as of right. But there are other uses that are not as of right. They're uses that are logically located in a particular place, whether it's a marine district or a light industrial district, a business district. So those are uses that are permitted there, but only upon review to make sure that they comply with certain standard requirements. And those standards are in the code. And they vary depending on the use. Some of them are general and some of them are specific. I'll explain in a minute. So in this case, the town board has determined that most special exception permits must be reviewed for adhering to these standards to make sure there are no adverse impacts or that they're mitigated to the Zoning Board of Appeals. The Planning Board also could grant special exception permits. depending on what the use is. They primarily do site plan review, as you probably know. So what is a special exception permit in our town? These are, in fact, uses that are by law permitted in those zone districts. Okay? That's already been established through legislation and the code, but only, as I said, if they meet certain standards. For example, what are some of those? Bed and breakfast in a residential neighborhood, okay? You need a permit for that. You need to be reviewed by the zoning board to make sure that you are it's your principal residence, that you live there, that you're going to have on-site parking and so on. Churches, schools, fire stations, restaurants, hotels, storage facilities. There's a whole bunch of them. Those are just some examples of the kinds of things that are permitted. All these battery energy storage systems, those are also permitted in a LI zone district in our code, but only by special exception permit. So, let me go over this. Mary, did you actually hand out, you said you were going to? You did. All right, doesn't matter. This is section 280-124. 280 is the section of the code that deals with zoning. Okay. So it's 142, and the code is right on the website, the town's website, if you want to look at it. It's pretty easy, because if you go to the home page, there's just a button on the bottom that says town code. And if you want to know anything about the zoning code, you just enter 280, and it'll take you right there. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 standards of general review for any special exception permit application. And I'll just read them very quickly.
We'll make copies of that so everybody can take them.
Good, okay, that's great.
Yeah, okay.
Because when you go before any board, and the ZBA is an appellate board, which means we are a quasi-judicial entity. We are a lay court of law. Okay? So we have appellate jurisdiction, which means if somebody says, the building department says, you can't do that, you have the right to appeal that decision based on saying the zoning is too restrictive, it's unfair to me. Okay? Here's a really simple example. You have a house, you want to put a deck in the backyard attached to your house. Your house is sitting 35 feet from the rear yard property line, which is conforming, but now you want to put a deck on the back. So now maybe it's going to be 25 feet from the rear yard setback. All you have to do is come to the zoning board, fill out an application, and say, I need an area variance because I don't meet those setbacks, which is in the bulk schedule. So that's simple enough. With general exception permits, the standards include: the use will not prevent the orderly and reasonable use of adjacent properties or of properties in adjacent use districts. B, the use will not prevent the orderly and reasonable use of permitted or legally established uses in the district wherein the requested use is located, or of permitted or legally established uses in adjacent use district. This is all legal gobbledygook, just basically says not going to harm anything next door. All right. C, the safety, health, welfare, comfort, convenience, or the order of the town will not be adversely affected by the proposed use and its location. Most of you are very familiar with that one. D, the use will be in harmony with and promote the general purposes and intent of this chapter. The use will be compatible with its surroundings and with the character of the neighborhood and of the community in general, particularly with regard to visibility, scale, and overall appearance. Right? That speaks to an aesthetic value, a sense of place. Right? F, that all proposed structures, equipment, and material shall be readily accessible for fire and police protection. And finally, the proposal shall comply with the requirements of Chapter 236, which is the stormwater management, meaning all stormwater must be retained on site. Now, it's not up to the zoning board to figure this out so much as it is incumbent upon the applicant, the burden's on an applicant, basically, to prove their case. They have to address these standards, and when we write a decision, how they address them will be part of that decision. So it just doesn't say, yeah, they checked all the boxes. You have to explain why they did or did not check those boxes. But each one of those uses also might have additional reviewing standards. So what I pulled out here I know of that interest. In the case of a hotel or a motel, all right, the issuance of a special exception permit, this is in the template I use for writing these decisions, as applied for in this application, is also subject to the following specific criteria and requirements which have or have not been met pursuant to section 280- whatever it is of the town code. And in this case, 280-35B4 says, transient hotels or motels, resort hotels or motels, or conference facilities are permitted provided the following requirements are met. Minimum parcel size shall be 5 acres. The maximum number of guest units shall be one unit per 6,000 square feet of land without public water or sewer. 2, 1 unit per 4,000 square feet of land with public water and sewer. C, no music, entertainment, or loudspeaker system shall be available shall be audible from beyond the property line. And D, the maximum size of a guest unit shall be 600 square feet. All right. So each one of those uses, a church has some, a fire station has some. All right, they all have additional standards. Now, that is basically what a special exception or a special use permit is. Let me tell you about a use variance. A use variance allows the Board of Appeals to permit someone to use their property in a way that the zoning code does not allow at all. Okay? So let's say you wanted to put a funeral parlor next to your house. That would, it's a de facto change of zone, basically. If they say that they can prove based on the use variance standards, then we have to consider it. However, those standards are an incredibly high bar. I mean, I've been doing this 18 years. I think maybe 2 have been granted. All right, so let me tell you what those standards are. I'm going to go to my template again. All right. Oh, by the way, what this requires is going to the building department first. They then will issue what's called a notice of disapproval saying, I can't approve this building permit because this is not a permitted use in that zone district. Okay? Special exception permits, although I don't really think this is the right way to do it, but in our town, it comes directly to the zoning board. It doesn't have to go to the building department. And why do I say that? Well, we still retain what's called original jurisdiction, but many times I've looked at these and I thought, they need variances too. You know, they don't just need their permit, they're not meeting the bulk schedule. It's incumbent upon the zoning officials in the building department, the plans examiners, to make that call, not me. So we usually have to send it back, or you know, it's back and forth. So I think it's easier for property owners and all of the boards if everything started in one place, and on that piece of paper, you knew exactly who you had to go to, trustees, and zoning. What do you need to do to get the project done, you know? But because it's just not good government when things go back and forth and back and forth. It's a detriment to everybody. So we can, in fact, we don't have to grant a use variance. We could say, we are going to overturn the notice of disapproval because we're going to do a code interpretation. And we're going to disagree with the code. We're going to say the code really intended to be read this way. And then that becomes de facto law until it is codified through a legislative process by a change in code with a public hearing. So what are the standards for a use variance? Town law, the first town law, the applicant cannot realize a reasonable return for each and every permitted use under the existing regulations for the particular district where the property is located, as demonstrated by the submittal of competent evidence. That means often very complicated financial documents, looking at economic hardship and so on. The second is the hardship is unique to the subject property. Okay? In other words, this is not going to apply town-wide. This is just this one piece of land. Third, the requested use variance, if granted, will not alter the essential character of the neighborhood. 4, the alleged hardship has not been self-created, and that's a very high bar, because in most instances, case law says, you know, caveat emptor, if you bought it, you should have known what you were getting into, what the law allowed you and required you to do. And finally, grant of a use variance is the minimum action necessary and adequate to address the unnecessary hardship and at the same time, and this is important, preserve and protect the character of the neighborhood and the health, safety, and welfare of the community. The zoning board always does what's called a balancing test. Every one of these standards needs to be looked at, but it's not like 5%, 10%, 20%. We have to balance the welfare of the community against the benefit to the applicant. And if the hardship for the community outweighs the benefit to the applicant, and it is proven through a public record, we deny it. So that's the difference. Is that clear? I mean, the two different things? Okay. Well, let me just summarize it very briefly. Special exception permits come to the zoning board. They are uses that the zoning code says you can have where your property is located. But we have to review it to make sure it doesn't have adverse impacts on the rest of the neighborhood. All right. A use variance says you're not allowed to do what you want on that piece of property. And you have to come before the board then to say, I need a use variance to let me do what I want on that property that the law says I can't do that, okay? And that very, very high standards to get, you know, jump through in order to get that. Let's see if there was anything else. I think that sort of summarizes it. I'll be happy to take general questions if appropriate.
Give me that sheet. Yeah. Everybody's going to get a copy of this sheet. So, so remember, and you're going to get a handout with the description. The Mattituck Hotel is on 11.8 acres. When that first application came in, it was on the original 7.8 acres. So it had to go get 3 more acres in order for them then to put in an application that was a 121-room hotel, a 300-seat catering facility, a 200-seat restaurant, an indoor water park, and 500 total parking spaces. So if the reason Leslie was here is that it came up a confusion around whether that application had to actually go get a zoning change, which it does not. And that's what Leslie was saying, and that handout that you're going to get is what she talked about. And so I know it's a bit confusing, but we needed to bring that to your attention today, and the Civic Association is in fact going to hold a meeting on the zoning codes and what's allowed in each of the zoning districts in town. That hotel is on what's considered general business, okay? So, I don't want to put you in the spot of questions, but I think if Bob goes next and he talks about if a specific question comes up on the hotel, that would it be okay then he could answer it?
He can answer it. He's not and he knows everything about secret there is to know. And let me say one other thing. No decision can be rendered by the Zoning Board of Appeals unless a secret determination is made. Okay, true with planning also. And all of those general ones like the deck on your back of your house, that's a variance. That's a just basically bulk schedule, and it's setbacks and height and lot coverage. That's always what's called a type 2 action. So we just declare that at the beginning of every public hearing and boom, we're done, we can make a decision. When zoning and planning have concurrent jurisdiction, as is the case in this application and many, many others, One of them is going to be lead agency, meaning they conduct the secret determination. Right? In this particular instance, planning board is lead agency. ZBA will have to review and adopt or change that determination before, we can have a hearing, but we can't make a decision until the secret determination is made. So they all kind of work like this together.
So she just did the brilliant segue into the next piece that we're going to cover. So now you needed that overall. Now we're going to get into the specific citizen tools that can be used. One citizen tool is the comprehensive plan. Second citizen tool is the State Environmental Review Act, otherwise known as SECRA. And the third citizen tool is the amendment to the New York State Constitution. It has 15 words. Every citizen has a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. So the next session of today has our brilliant expert in South Old Town on what does SECRA mean, but he's going to narrow approach it today because of what we are going to do in terms of next steps. Whenever a project happens and you hear about the project and all those details, and remember, I'm circling back to why the answer that we're asking and answering is, what does a citizen do, whether they like the project or they don't like the project? And I'm sure all of you have gone to town board meetings or planning board meetings, and people will get up, and maybe you even have gotten up and said, I don't like this project because it's going to block my trees or something. Guess what? That's not strong enough. But when you write letters or you make an approach, whether you want something or you don't want it, if you cite those three tools, the weight of that letter, it has got more bearing on your board members and their decision. And one of the goals that we, your civic association, has decided on is we wanted you to be informed and educated so that if you decide on a decision that you will actually be using and citing the language that has strength. So having said that, I know Bob is probably going to clean it up and make it clear, but please give a very warm welcome. He actually shows up whenever you ask and explains this absolutely beautiful, it's a beautiful tool, the citizens tool called SECRA. Give him a round of applause.
I really shouldn't say anything, should I? That introduction, there is no way I can succeed.
If it's okay with you, I think I'll stand on the corner.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This is my Italian heritage. I always feel like when I come to something in Southland, I should mention that the Solinskis on my mother's side actually were farmers, but in Poland. So I have a tiny little bit I can hang on to. Anyway, so by way of introduction, as a kid growing up in the woods of Western Connecticut, you know, my entire life was shaped by hanging out in the woods and playing in the streams and just everything that you could imagine. I mean, it really was idyllic. And so I decided I wanted to pursue a career in science and environment and all of that. And it took me about 10 minutes to realize that the vast majority of stuff I wanted to study in the effort to protect the world, we kind of knew. The problem wasn't that we didn't know what to do. The problem was we didn't know how to do it. And this really came down to the fact that 95% of what your community looks like is based on tiny little and larger land use decisions happening at boards every single day, every single week. Those long agendas, and one person wants to put on a deck, but somebody else wants to build a 200,000 square foot resort. And it's all ground through this process. And the public, by and large, is rightfully terrified to figure out where do you dip your toe into this mess. I still am, 38 years on, sometimes trying to figure out who's actually in charge of what. So with the sort of backdrop of root canal, I guess what I want to tell you is something that almost nobody ever knows about SECRA, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, is what the legislature intended when it wrote it. And there are some wonderful things in here that if you ever get the like squirrely eye look from somebody sitting up on a board, I want you to bring this with you, because this is what the legislature of the state of New York said was the obligation of the general public looking at the environment. First, the maintenance of the quality of the environment for people of the state that is helpful and pleasing to the senses is a matter of statewide concern. It's not just a little town thing, the state legislature said it. Every citizen, every one of you, every one of your neighbors you can drag in, anybody else, has a responsibility to contribute to the preservation and enhancement of the quality of the environment. So sometimes you get into these debates where they say, yeah, well, that's all nice, but the developer has a particular project and that's kind of what we want to do here. Well, you know, guess what? Every citizen has a responsibility to argue in defense of those things. They can't speak for themselves. Third, there's a need to understand the relationship between a high-quality ecological system and the general welfare of the people of the state, and you might argue that the recent environmental amendment is sort of further proof of that. Fourth, the enhancement and community resources depends on the quality of the physical environment. Fifth, the capacity of the environment is limited. Sixth, the intent of the legislature is that to the fullest extent, policies, statutes, regulations, and ordinances of the state and all of its political subdivisions should be interpreted and administered in accordance with the policies of this article, which is the Environmental Quality Review Act. Seventh, the intent of the legislature that the protection and enhancement of the environment, human and community resources, shall be given appropriate weight with all social and economic considerations. Eighth, it's the intent of the legislature that every agency conduct their affairs with an awareness that they are stewards of the air, water, land, and living resources. That's every agency, every decision-making body, every building inspector, every code enforcement officer, every planning board, all the way up the line, every town board. They have an obligation to protect the environment for the use and enjoyment of this and future generations. And finally, it's the intent of the legislature that every agency which regulates the activities of individuals or corporations and public agencies which are found to affect the quality of the environment shall regulate these activities with due consideration given to preventing environmental damage. That's just the preamble to this law. So when you get down about it, somebody back in 1975 figured out that we needed to make a very strong statement about the integration of human activity and human settlement and environmental protection. So you are commanded by the state legislature to show up, to let these boards know what you think about environmental protection. And frankly, you know, as a kid, the thing that motivated me to get into this work was, I always thought if the environment could speak, whatever that means, you know, I mean, this may be Pollyannish, but you know, trees and birds and all those things. If they showed up in town hall, try to imagine what the world would look like versus what normally happens, right? There's no voice. And so the only voice the environment really has are people like yourselves and people sitting here who get this and who pay attention. So then the second thing is, how do you speak the language that allows you to take these statements, these broad statements, and make them work in a process that is part of the language of land use planning and design development? And it's not that easy, right? Because SECRA's got a very long, complicated process. Where I want to focus really is on the beginning of that process. In other words, how do we get from there's an application we see on the wall to how does this board basically make a commitment to looking at it comprehensively, and really most importantly, maybe one of the most important things, or the most important thing that SECRA provides is a requirement to consider alternatives. And sometimes developers don't like this very much because they got a plan they want to do, and it may not be the plan that the community wants. And the idea here is the balancing act to try to figure out how do we best mitigate environmental harm. So the very first thing that in this case, the planning board will have to do is they have to decide what this project is. And the law provides for a couple of different types of projects. The type 2 action that Leslie mentions is an action that needs no further environmental review. Variances are one of those, code interpretations are another, and there's a series of things. Most of them are kind of obvious, replacement in kind of something that's already there. It would seem obvious that you're not going to have an entire full-blown environmental review. There's another group of projects called type 1 actions, and type 1 actions are generally deemed to be those projects that are most likely to require an environmental impact statement because they are most likely to have at least one potentially significant environmental impact associated with them. And by the way, all you need is one. If it may have one significant environmental impact, you must do an environmental impact statement. I debate this 38 years. I can't get anybody to open up the code and read that. And it's right there. That's what it says. You need 1. Now, you may have 10. So, the type 1 actions, there's a list established by the state of New York in the implementing regulations. This particular project in Mattituck affects more than 10 acres when you look at its entirety. And the square footage of the building, to my recollection, is also large enough to fit into this category of a type 1 action. 200,000, I think it's 150. I think in a community of less than 150,000
Yes.
people, over 100,000 square feet makes it a type 1 action. So there are 2 things you can check right off the list that basically says, according to the state of New York and its implementing regulations, a project of this size and scale is a project that is likely to have 1 or more significant environmental impacts, and 2, is likely to require an environmental impact statement. That's ammunition to tell the board that as it's pondering what it's going to do with this application, right there in those 2 lines, it tells you those are reasons why you'd want to do an environmental impact statement. Now, you can have lots more reasons. That type 1 list is not exhaustive. In other words, towns can deem a type 1 action based on something that isn't on that list. But having the list helps, right? The other thing that they're going to want to look at is there's something called an unlisted action, which wouldn't have one of those 2 criteria, but can still have a potentially significant environmental effect. So once you classify the action, then in the case of a type 1 action, it has to be basically a notice that the application is in and the general specs on the application and something called an environmental assessment form go out to the involved agencies, and the involved agencies have about 30 days to get back to the presumed lead agency. They can argue if they want to be the lead agency, but let's make it simple. Let's assume nobody wants to be lead agency. The planning board will have to be lead agency because it has the broadest jurisdictional authority, so it'll come back to them. Within 30 days, everybody's comments, when I say everybody, these are the involved agencies. They have some permit to give. Zoning board has a permit to give. Some cases, health department has a permit to give. They all get notice. When I worked for about a decade with the county health department, my job was to sift through the wreckage of Suffolk County's development applications and respond in the county health department's behalf to all those different things that came in. We got a pretty good sense as to what was going on in the county when you were coordinated with, and the stack every Monday was like this. So the point really is that you have a certain period of time for the agencies to give input. Now the public doesn't really have a formal role at in other words, there's not a necessity of a public hearing. Nonetheless, I advise all the time, most boards appreciate knowing kind of where the community is whenever the community is there. So the sooner you can put a letter in, what you think about the project, maybe you think it needs an environmental impact statement, what the potential impacts are, whether it's the hearing or the formal public hearing, which by the way may not happen until the draft environmental impact statement. So one of the problems we have here is that sometimes the decision is made about the environmental review, and you're over here waving your arms around going, we have all these concerns, and they're like, well, we'll have a public hearing later. And we already decided not to do an environmental impact statement, so, And the law provides that you can go back and change your mind, but God forbid, that almost never happens, right? Because it might be difficult, or people get mad, or whatever it is. I mean, I've argued for that all the time. It's specific that if there's new information, you should rescind your decision and go again. Just better to get it in early, right? So the idea here is that once the action is classified and once it's coordinated, then there has to be something called a determination of significance. All that really means is, are we going to do an environmental impact statement or not? What's the benefit of an environmental impact statement? An environmental impact statement provides you with a guarantee that you are going to get in one place at one time under one roof. Description of the action, a discussion of the potential environmental impacts, a discussion of the extent of those impacts and their permanency, a discussion of mitigation measures, and a discussion of viable alternatives to the project. You can't, the law doesn't allow you to say, guy wants to build a grocery store and I'd rather he built a missile silo. It has to be somewhat in line with what the zoning provides, but it can have a lot to do with mitigation, right? So the mitigation measures can be very, very important here. So that mandate to look at alternatives is a very powerful tool for taking the public's interest and taking the public's concerns and infusing them into an alternative that has to be looked at side by side with the applicant's proposal. So that's what the draft environmental impact statement provides, and that's why guys like me often want to have that. It also avoids, and I just saw it this week, the town of Southold has a project, the Supreme Court Medical Office Building, where there's basically 2 competing applications. The applicant came in with one application. It looked like they might be going to get a positive declaration, then poof, another application shows up for less intense. And the board is, in my opinion, horse trading which project it is, the developer's like, hey, you like this one, you like that one? That's not the way it's supposed to work. The way it's supposed to work is, at the earliest moment, you are supposed to know what the application is. You're supposed to render a determination on the type of action. You're then supposed to render a determination on whether you're going to do an environmental impact statement. And if there's mitigating alternatives you want to consider, you put them in that document. Now, why does everything have to go in the document? Most of you who've been in the civics sector have understood trying to thumb through a file with 900 pieces of paper from 11 years ago when the guy wanted to build a dog kennel, and today it's a grocery store, and tomorrow it's a woodworking shop. That's all sometimes in the same place, and you don't know what it is. So this draft environmental impact statement says, look, this is the project, these are the implications of the project, these are the potential alternatives, you comment on that. So you get transparency, you basically get something that the public can understand, and that's it's in the law that it should be readable and understandable by the public. And look, consultants obviously, they do their, and you should know this too, that document is prepared by consultants that work for the applicant in almost all situations. So the document, much like an attorney, is going to provide the best possible showing of the applicant's project. And as long as you know that, you can review it with that eye. Sometimes it's like, well, the draft environmental impact statement says there'll be no traffic impact. Yeah, but there's a lot of traffic. And I've been reviewing environmental impact statements for almost 40 years. There's never going to be a traffic impact. Yet here we are. How did that happen? Well, it happened because there was advocacy on behalf of the applicant. But if you kind of know that going in, you should not be fearful of saying, yeah, those numbers don't look right. I don't think there's going to be less nitrogen after we build it than there was before we built it. I got a project right now, God's honest truth, I'm in court on this project. It's a residentially zoned piece of property, 1 unit per 5 acres, most protective zoning in Southampton town. The developer came in, they tried to get a change of zone so they could build a resort. They didn't get it, so they came in with a subdivision plan, and then they said the resort was just a customary amenity. 100,000 square feet, theater, bowling alley, 10,000 square feet of retail, seating for 200, bar, health club, 3 pools, all.
Oh my God.
And they approved it. That's why I'm suing them. But anyway, in a normal world, the point is you get this fleshed out early enough on, and if you see it written in the impact statement that an entire resort is just a customary amenity, you should feel free to question that. But you have the document in front of you to look at. Everybody's working from the same thing, whatever it is, and the job of the public is to make it better and make it work, right? So you have to show up, you have to point out the problems, and the way it works is the draft environmental impact statement goes to something called the final environmental impact statement, which is, theoretically, the answers to all of the questions that are raised during the public hearing process, and then the underlying document in the final environmental impact statement lead the lead agency something called a finding statement, which is what are we actually going to do? You can deny it. You can have a negative finding statement. Or you can have a finding statement that picks one of the alternatives, or you can have a finding statement that does some mitigation from the original. But the fundamental point here is, at this stage of the game, and I'd be more than happy to kind of, as this goes on, to come back and walk through it. The main thing is to try to, whatever your position is, whatever your opinion is about this project, to understand that the environment itself under secret is broadly defined, and you have a right through all of these things I just talked about to make that known. It's not just the birds and bunnies. It's air quality, it's traffic, it's aesthetics, it's community character. It's basically everything a guy like me would think of to try to define the environment in the broadest terms. That's what the state legislature did. So you can talk about what the people across the street are going to see when this thing is built. You can talk about the fact that a giant parking lot pouring out onto an already congested roadway seems to be a problem. You can talk about obliterating 10 acres of trees, and is that really the best we can do? Do we want a water park in the middle of that? I mean, and I'm not saying, yeah, maybe you do, but all I'm saying is, like, all of that information, you have the ability, and actually Mary was kind enough, I think, to give me the very specific definition. I got it. You know, what are the environmental factors? Land, air, water, mineral resources, flora and fauna, so the ducks and bunnies do get in there. Noise, historic and aesthetic significance, so again, archaeological, historic, population patterns, community character, and to use that to your best ability, you can find in this comprehensive plan all kinds. I mean, if we ever do anything, get around to doing anything with this comprehensive plan, there's an awful lot in there that will drive very positive, sustainable environmental policy for the town, and that should eventually come to shape the zoning code. And if the zoning code and the comprehensive plan are aligned, and you do secret properly, you have a very good chance of actually having an engaged, community-driven process where one, the boards making the decisions have all the information that they can have. And let me tell you what, and having done this through the years, like right now, Southold is getting hit with a lot of development that didn't used to be the case around here, right? So the boards haven't really had the kind of, like on the south side, it's been like Armageddon for years. So those boards are a little more experienced with this stuff than, you know, somebody rolling in with a 200,000 square foot thing one day and 15, you know, condo units the next day, and, you know, all of that is starting to happen. So the more that the boards become educated, facile with this process, I also think the staff really should be working with them to try to improve everybody's ability to understand it. The developers, like everybody else, they behave better, right? They know, like if you go into a town that has a very strict application of the law, and you want to represent your client to the best of your ability, then you're going to try to stick to those rules. If you go in and it's like, you know, I talked to Joe and I think we can, you know, or here's an idea and there's an idea, then that works, and that's what will happen. So, you know, it's a little like parenting, you know, and everybody who's had kids can appreciate this. Like every time you try to cut them a break, it never works like to your advantage. Like they just come right back and they blow it up, and you're like, okay, now I got to be like a tough parent and I have to do the thing that I told you I was going to do. But, you know, but that's how we are. Right? We're all like this. I'm guilty of it. But so long as the system can be made to work, the more people understand this, the more people ask their leadership to make it work for them, the more everybody involved says, we can't just like pretend the secret thing is just kind of a paper shuffle and we did something. That's what gets you a better community, and the only way you get there is through the work that you all can do, and people like me and everybody here, in constantly beating the drum to make the process work in everybody's interest. This is what it means, this is what it says, this is how you do it. And I know, you know, even recently, you know, you get pushback because this is new. And it's like, ugh, now we have this to do, and the developer maybe doesn't want to do it, they're complaining about it. I mean, there's a number of projects where I think that the process has kind of gone awry. And I have some sympathy for the people who are in the decision-making position, because it's like, you know, suddenly you've just got added to your already piled up agenda like a gigantic responsibility that maybe you didn't have to do as much before, and now you do. And who wants to do that, right? So it's just human nature to try to like just say, all right, whatever, can we just move it on? Anyway, it works when you make it work. It doesn't work when you step away from it. And we're at a point in Southold town where the energy from the public to demand that that process work is at its all-time high. So I won't say much more than that. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer
Don't go
questions.
anywhere. Give him a round of applause. So before we do the question and answer, let me just, guys, would you, this is the next step, all right, hand this out. So here's what happened. I went to Bob, and I said to Bob, my observation is, by the time the planning board has the secret public hearing, the train has already left the station. So I said to Bob, will you help us get in front of that? And that's what we are doing. We are setting up a process that is going to go to the governing bodies so they know what your voice is before that public hearing, so that you are bringing a frame of reference to when you go to that public hearing. So Bob, now remember guys, remember, the Civic Association is neutral. We are not telling you how to think about this application. We are not telling you that. We just want to make sure that you have all the information for you to make a decision, and that you're going to cite those three tools that we talked about, and you're going to use it in your language when you write the letters to the governing bodies or show up at the public hearing. So one more thing, all right? Would you please tell them what a positive declaration is? And here's the reason why. And we're going to get to it in the letter you're going to write and the citations. And you'll, on your handout just now, the description of this project is on 11.8 acres. Say it again, 121 hotel rooms, 300-seat catering hall, 200-seat restaurant, a indoor water park. Think scale. So would you please,
Yeah,
mhm.
and let me just also say, even if you like the project, and I've never understood this, and I actually have had some developers who this has worked out, you want to do a positive you want to do an environmental impact statement because the environmental impact statement guarantees that all of these issues get heard. One of the principal ways that you litigate against a project is by not looking at these issues. So from a developer standpoint, or if you like the project, why not put the whole thing in a box, lets everybody have at it, and be done with it? And the nickel and diming along and not doing it, I don't think works in their interest either. Positive declaration, the determination that a lead agency makes when it's going to do an environmental impact statement or not require further environmental review is called the determination of significance. And it can be in two places, it breaks in two ways. A positive declaration means that you're going to do an environmental impact statement. A negative declaration means that there's not going to be further environmental review. I should have said it breaks three ways. On occasion, you can use something called a conditioned negative declaration, which means we're not doing an environmental impact statement, but we're adding some mitigation. I think it's kind of an anomaly. Either I think you should do it or not do it. But in any case, the positive declaration is the determination to go forward with the draft environmental impact statement.
Okay, so now, questions. Aurelia?
Yes, orally.
Orally. Well, just stand up and ask your question. And so if everybody who has a question, stand up, state your name and who you have the question to.
I was wondering if it was a really clear definition of the preserving of the character of the community. I come from France, and like you go into town and you're not allowed to, all in that town everything is bricks, and that's it. You can't build like a modern house. And lately there's been all these white and black, I think they call it farmhouse or something. And once it's like fine, two's fine, but it's like now it's like changing really, especially when you go like towards Valley Beach on Wickham. It's starting to really change the character of the community. So was that allowed? How is that defined?
So an individual, let's say an individual home application wouldn't be subject to this process.
Yeah.
The only way that that's really dealt with is you would have to have architectural standards. And some homeowners associations have some kind of review. I don't know in the town, Leslie.
We have no, on residential properties, there is no architectural review committee. In other words, you want to build your dream house, it is what it is.
Yeah,
yeah.
Some communities.
Only if it's in Eric's right, if it's in an historic district, then there is a review by the Historic Preservation Commission. And that's similar to what you have in France. We do not have form-based code in this community. Form-based code is a code that basically addresses what you're talking about. What kind of fencing material is allowed. It's more than just setbacks. It has to do with, they have it in Florida, like there are certain gated communities. They all have to have a similar aesthetic. They all have to have a kind of harmony with each other. Here, it's a hodgepodge. It's whatever you want to be. Now, in commercial properties, there is an architectural review committee.
And may I just interject right now, because Ron McGreevy said this, when the original Capital One building was built, at that time is when the town established an architectural review committee at that time. So anyway, thank you for that question. It doesn't apply for residential.
Well, because like in a letter, right? Like it would be just environmental, and then that would be part of it. Because how can I argue that this is not belonging to the community?
Right. So on this letter for this project, you absolutely can say that you want to see, that the project be consistent with the community's character. Because when you're looking at a large commercial project, you have more influence here on that than you do in an individual house with an individual lot, right? So the planning board can certainly take that up. A lot of that will, architectural renderings can be shown and drawn and included in the environmental impact statement. There's a process which I didn't mention called scoping, which is once you decide to do the environmental impact statement, Then there's a period of time when the public can comment on what should be in it,
Yeah,
within reason.
An example of that is design standards, like for the 7-Eleven here.
yeah.
It's CVS, that went through that design
Yeah.
standard
Yeah.
process in the town.
McDonald's was.
The
a big-
McDonald's,
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah.
I have a reflection. There's something since the last meeting that I cannot reconcile about the family of, that owns the land. It's been sitting there for 10 years with nothing happening. And then at the same time, the same family is working hand in hand with La Maña from La Chorritos about what to do with how to improve the cinema. So there's like, in really concerning like the community and what the community wants. So I can't reconcile those two, so I don't know.
Well, this is what we're working on.
Yeah.
And this specific, and using the comprehensive plan as the language, all right? So we'll get to this letter specifically in a second. So
Okay, thank you.
Doris, you want to
Yeah,
stand up
I-
and ask the question?
Well, I wanted to answer orally. What I had understood from the developer, that they're going to use a lot of glass,
And wood.
he said the front will be glass, even though it's behind a whole row of trees. What I'm saying is that could be something, but I find that I wish CEQA would do it first, and then we can go ahead and,
That is, if it works properly, it should, by the time you come through this process, be fully vetted by the public, have all of the input of all the other involved boards, and the planning board itself should be rendering decisions that reflect that input, as well as what's within the general, which you have to provide for the developer's rights on the property. But as far as like, whether it's got a whole glass wall or not, issues like that are the kinds of aesthetic issues that can be addressed in the impacts. In other words, they can be raised, they can argue their point why they think it has to be a glass wall, the public can come in and say, no, it shouldn't be. And they have the discretionary authority, and I think this is also something that you should think about. Boards have broad discretionary authority, like a planning board, and sometimes I feel like boards are just kind of like humbled by an applicant comes in, puts it down and says, we looked at it, I got a designer, and I got 2 experts, and you're like, okay. But they do have the ability, when properly motivated, to say, all right, you know what, let's put the brakes on this. Let's talk more about what this is gonna look like. Let's think about this. Maybe sometimes we wanna bring in our own architectural assistance, right? We may not have an architect in the planning department or whatever. You can do that too in the secret process. And by the way, the developer can be charged for a portion of the review done by the town to provide it for in the statute. So if you need a particular level of expertise, you can hire it, bring it in, they're working for the public, and have them look at this project and see whether or not it can, but that's where it happens, is within the impact statement review process.
I did want to ask,
Let Stephen, do you want to stand up, your name?
Yes, thank you, Mary, for setting this up. It's very important, and thanks, Al, for coming. Greg, you did a great job, by the way. Leslie, we've worked together for a long time, and I know you're an expert in this area. I just want to make it clear for everyone here. We keep talking about site plan, we keep talking about the planning, but a condition precedent to even get there is for them to get this special exception permit. Now, Leslie has said that, there's certain standards that they have to meet, because a special exception is deemed, yes, a permitted use in that zoning district, but it was also deemed by the town board to be a problematic use. That's why it has these certain standards that you have to meet, and it's looked at on a case-by-case basis. So a hotel in the zoning district is not permitted as of right. So I don't even know why the planning board's wasting their time before it even gets the green light from the zoning board. And I know Leslie can't speak to
No, but
specifics.
Steve and Bob is
But
going
there's
to
a
address it.
legal process issue, which is they can't issue a permit, and the planning board can't issue a permit until the secret process is complete. So typically what I would, like in this particular case, I would want to take all of the special permit issues, that could strengthen my hand, push those through the secret process to be part of the review, so that makes the job easier for the zoning board when in other words, they can't issue the permit, and the planning board can't issue a permit or make a determination until the secret process is over.
Without a doubt, and that's why there's concurrent jurisdiction. and the secret process should go full bore. But that doesn't mean that the site plan process has to go forward. They could take lead agency and declare it, POSDEC a type 1 and get the EIS. But the thing, again, I'm harping on, and this is why I had that disagreement with the developer, because the developer was leading the public to believe that this was a permitted use and all they needed was a site plan. That's not true, and it has to go in front of the zoning board, and I think that's another front in this fight that you have to go to and make your voice heard, because if there's no special exception, there's no hotel. Because you have, not only are those standards that Leslie brought up.
And you will have them now, right?
Yes,
Yes. Okay.
but there's also another section in our code that says there's 16 matters to be considered on top of those standards. So the zoning board has to take into account 16 other factors. This is not a home run. Special permit, I use special permit because Shelter Island, we call it special permits, and that's where I've seen you before. Special exceptions, they've been denied in the past before. This isn't a foregone conclusion. So if you look at Sports East, that was a special exception. It got denied. I know there was some other issues with the definition and whatever, but it's not a foregone conclusion. So that is the first, and I say the most important battlefield.
But you guys won't take it up. I mean, you won't take it up till after the secret process, right?
It depends.
Okay, so
If the applications are submitted, when there's concurrent jurisdiction, applications are typically submitted at the same time. And a while ago, because, as Stephen points out, developers basically said, hey, I don't want to go through this expensive, arduous site planning process without an insurance that I'm going to get this special exception permit. It's a lot of money, it's a lot of time, and then if they say no, you know, that doesn't seem fair. So I understood that argument, and I said, all right, you know, why don't we do this? Why don't we try to let the ZBA hire a consultant and be lead agency, and we'll do SECRA and all of that. It's so out of the wheelhouse of the zoning board. It's, as you can hear, it's a very technical, complicated process, and it requires expertise. The zoning board has appointed lay people there. And I'm the department head. I happen to be a professor of architecture, so I can bring some skills to looking at the surveys and the plans. However, the planning board has a planning department staffed with professional planners that do a lot of heavy lifting, okay, including working on SECRA. So it just didn't make any sense, because I was finding that my board was getting kind of blindsided, let's say, by by applicants with very deep pockets that had expensive consultants that were doing end runs around everything, and I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know, I'm not so sure. And you know, if you're hiring consultants, we hired a consultant. I disagreed with our own consultant, to tell you the truth. We're never using that consultant again. Nevertheless, I mean, you know, and they're paying for the consultant that the ZBA has hired, by the way, okay?
Okay.
And it just wasn't working well. It really wasn't
So
working well.
Leslie, just again, because of what Stephen's bringing up, so that we're all clear,
Yeah.
Bob is going to address this.
Maybe you can clarify for me, because what I'm trying to figure out is, because the state law doesn't allow the zoning board of appeals to render a determination on the project before SECRA is complete. Whoever the lead agency is has to do the process. So what I would try to do is to take all of the special permit concerns, get them into the review process, have the planning board be well aware of those before the zoning board, because they can't make a decision without it, right?
Yeah, absolutely, but
I'm ready to cook.
Keep this for us,
Yes.
okay?
what I would recommend, and Leslie, you know, made a cogent argument why she's not doing it, but I would argue that the ZBA should be lead agency.
Oh, I see.
And not the planning board, because it's a type 1 action, so it's presumed to have at least one significant negative impact to the environment. So you're going to have to declare a type 1 action POSDEC. It's going to need an EIS. So the consultant is gonna do all that work for you, and you as a zoning board can lean on the planning department staff to help you out with the CEQA process, because, you know, it's not only helping the community by wasting the, because again, we're dividing, it's almost dividing and conquering. Let's focus on the use and whether it's appropriate for the town and appropriate in that area. Let's focus on the special exception. Because it helps the community, but it also helps the applicant. Why are you gonna have the applicant go through all this rigmarole with site design and site plans and this and that, when they don't even know if the use is gonna be allowed at the end of the day? So, again, I think it's important for streamlining the process and not getting it muddied with two separate boards going at the same time. And I know a lot of times it makes sense to have concurrent jurisdiction and things go on, but this is so important to make sure that even the use in and of itself is appropriate for our community pursuant to the special permit standards, that stay with the zoning board first.
All right, Stephen, thank you. Is there any simple, so everybody is clear, because we're
I-
using a process
I mean,
here.
I get that. I think the only problem is the law provides that the board with the broadest jurisdictional authority is supposed to be the lead agency, right? So typically, the planning board is considered to be the board with the broadest jurisdictional authority over the action. I don't disagree, by the way, that if you could knock it out at the use phase, that would be great. But I think the problem is that you've got, you know, the developers will basically argue to their advantage if they feel like they're gonna get a better shake from one board or the other. So if it looks like they may not get the use, they'll probably demand and tell the town, listen, broadest jurisdictional authority is the planning board. I have one of these right now in East Hampton where I've got a 70-acre commercial industrial subdivision, and the applicant needs a special permit and a planning board review, and the ZBA flipped it to the planning board to be lead agency for the same reasons you did. The ZBAs don't necessarily consider that their wheelhouse has enough in it. But your point is a very good one, which is if you deny the use out of the box, then the agony of the rest of the process. However, you'd probably have to pause deck it anyway, which means there's still going to be an environmental impact statement. The planning board is still going to be involved, but
Well, not
All
necessarily
right,
the planning
so
board, you
can-
have the planning staff.
All right, Stephen, but can we, because
Yeah.
now we're limited in time, and we need to get the community in terms of what their steps are. There's a system issue for sure, but let's be able to do this, all right? And thank you for bringing it up and clarifying it for the other night. Let's take just two more questions, and then we'll get to the next step. So Eric, and then, okay, go ahead.
Eric Kramer, I have 5 years' experience as the president of the Historical Society here in Mattituck-Laurel, and I'm the historian now. And I have a question. Who represents the public? Who represents the community in this process?
well, you're looking at most of them. I mean,
No, okay. These are the individuals in the community. You live in the community, maybe outside of it, but okay. But in the process, and based on experience of similar projects, who represents, what is there an organization?
So typically, you have localized civic organizations for various hamlets, and that exists throughout the region. Those groups, organizations like mine, we're based in Southwell, but we look at all 5 towns. So I have membership support from the 5 towns of eastern Long Island. I'm involved in projects in Montauk.
Understood. Okay, so does this civic association
Take a position.
collect the collective
Eric, in our
opinions
town,
of the
Yes.
public and
It-
present them to the
absolutely,
system?
absolutely, Eric. In our town,
Mhm.
if, once you got involved and once you understood process, that is why the civics were so important to inform and educate and then come up with a plan of action so that voice could be heard before the governing
And
bodies.
is this what we're doing?
This is what we're doing. Today, this is what we're doing.
Why doesn't the civic take a stand
We're
one way or
doing-
another?
Okay.
Because it's always to inform, and yet we're looking for somewhat.
So you're
some
helping me,
organization
yes,
to-
Doris, you're helping me with this process. In order to make a decision, you need to get data. The very first step is to hear from the developer in the project. Now you need to get information from the community. That's what we're doing today. That's what we're going to cover with this letter. And we're going to do a survey and send it out to all the members. And then we collect that data,
Take a
and
position.
then Based on that information, and I'm just going to circle back, the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association has taken only one position in the past, and it was the application, very first application on the 21 acres across from the Capital One, and that's where they wanted a change of zone, and as of right, that 21 acres was R80, 2-acre homes. But the change of zone was to have retail and affordable apartments on top. The Civic gathered data from, in this process that we're doing right now, and the community said, we don't want that project because of it being rezoned. And if you allow that, then will it have a ripple effect? We took a position there. So Doris, based on our next steps, the Civic Association, in collecting the data, will take a position if that's what this community wants us to do. But we have to gather the data first. We can't just have, I don't like it. We need actual data. Dave and Sir.
Mary, if I could just piggyback on that real briefly. Our elected officials are supposed to represent the community. And by virtue of our elected officials, so are the appointed boards. The appointed boards are supposed to share the philosophy of the community. And when they're reviewing these applications, they should be almost standing in the shoes for the community. That's who they represent, the appointed board. So I argue, not only us in the room and Groundswell, we go up there and we make our opinions known, but the general philosophy of protecting this town, protecting the environment, protecting the community character should be shared by the appointed board members.
Dave, you want to stand up and?
Dave Bergen-Kutchug. I think that what's critical in this process is exactly what's going on today. You're listening to the experts provide you with factual information on the codes and the processes. And as you advocate forward to rely on those specific codes, processes, and not on emotion, because when people stand up to argue a case in front of whatever board it is, to have facts and to be able to say specifically this doesn't meet this part of the code because of X, Y, Z, will have a lot more impact than somebody becoming very emotional up there just saying this doesn't meet the character of the community, so we don't want it just because it doesn't meet the character of the community. Very valid, extremely valid, but go in with the facts. And I thank Mary and the speakers today on trying to inform and educate us about that. And the other part of the inherent problem that has been touched on briefly is how to handle the advocacy that's coming to the boards from, I'll call it, big money in the community. And that's, as somebody who was an elected official, that is a very challenging position to be in when big money in the community is impacting the decisions of people on the boards, particularly when you got appointed people on boards rather than elected people on boards. So just realize that. It's common for people to come in with a project that has 18, 20 components to it, knowing they're not going to get it, so we'll take 2 or 3 out along the way. And as we take 2 or 3 out, whether it's a helicopter landing pad or whatever it is, there's more of an ability in their minds to get it approved. And again, it doesn't matter, that shouldn't make any difference. What should make a difference is the specifics in the code and addressing the specifics of the code and why the project doesn't meet that criteria.
Thank you, Dave. You said that really clearly. This gentleman has been
Hi, my name is Rick Kelly from Mattituck. I want to thank all the members of the panel, and especially this gentleman over here. I was here, that January 30th, and I thought that was the most profound. That was like, I want him. He knows what he's talking about. There's a lot of details here, and my head is swimming. I'm just a simple Marine infantry officer. I assume most of us don't want this. Tell me where to attack. Tell me what I have to do, and tell me when I have to do it. That's all I want to know.
Yes, here we go. We're going to answer your question. All right. So Doris, one last thing.
I just wanted to say, with the BEST, the energy storage system,
Yes.
there was an online petition. Could the, you know, if you come up with a negative feeling for this, you know, could you send around an online petition? It was very, very successful. We had thousands of people signing it. You know, would you think of doing something like that?
We're going through a process. Dave, if I may, based on what Doris just said, the Cutchogue Civic Association held that informational meeting. So when you look at signing a petition, how much information do you have when you sign that petition versus, so would you just make a comment about that meeting?
I'm saying both.
Yes, it is not one or the other. That's why it is a process. Do you want to just address that?
It's just in the meeting on the battery storage facility, the goal was to inform and educate. It was not to take a stance. It was to inform and educate. And in the preparations for that meeting, reaching out to the appropriate speakers to come in, the experts in these areas, raised an awareness level, and I'll just say it at Town Hall, it was no coincidence that there was a moratorium announced a few hours before that. The concept of a moratorium was announced a few hours before that forum took place. Because it was the work of the Civic Association in prepping for that meeting to just inform and educate, not take a stance. So that's what made that meeting so successful.
And they didn't even have to get to take a stance because of a result of it all. You got, to the point that Steve made, you got your elected officials who heard what was going on. Please let me get to this letter because I promised that you were going to leave at 12. Here's what the next step is, and I'm sorry, sir, I forgot your first name. Rick, this is the answer to what Rick just brought up. Now, if you're going to decide to write a letter, here's the letter. You're going to address it to the planning board chair and to the planning director. And you're going to say, I am writing to you about the proposed. You put in the project. All that information in the letter is what you need. Now, the next sentence, I am for or against this project for the following reasons, which are specifically addressed in the South Hole Town Comprehensive Plan. Now turn the page to ask you, as a community member, to go read the comprehensive plan and come up with, what we did was we put together, it comes right out of the comprehensive plan, and it's 4 chapters. We're simply giving you an example. So let's use the first example, and this goes to Aurelia, when she brought up about what something looks like, community character, all right? You can say on your letter, I am against this project because I believe the aesthetics and the compatible scale does not fit our community character. Or, out of the economic development, you can say, I am for this project because I believe it's important that 50 jobs are going to come from this project. Because remember, the developer said that, right? All right. Or, traffic. I am against this project because I believe there will be challenges related and to this, to the scale of this project that is going to impact our community character, our quality of life. The letter, and then you just use this suggestions. So Rick, am I answering your question? To
Yes.
say I'm against it or I'm for it, but you cite a reason, okay? You cite a reason. You mail it, the address is there to those governing bodies, and please send it to the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association, because we are collecting all of that data in order, based on what you're saying, to take a position. Now,
What's the address?
it's a box,
It's at the bottom.
yeah, it's on the letter. So guys, just stay with me for a second. And I'm going back to what Bob DeLuca talked about in the secret. We want to get out in front. The planning board is going to hold the public hearing either in March or April. We start sending them information now. We're getting out in front of that public hearing. Am I communicating clearly here? All right. That's why we're doing this meeting today. Now, you have the letters. We are going to be sending this very thing out now to the 60 people who came the other night that are not Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association members, but the fact that they showed up was important, as well as the rest of the membership of the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association. That's one. And we're not going to be able to do it because of time. We are going to be sending you all survey questions about this project. And these questions came right from SECRA, the State Environmental Review Act. So these questions are not subjective. They are what you use to determine information to make a decision. And the planning board is going to know that you are citing the 3 citizen tools: the comprehensive plan, which is the roadmap that our community said, this is what we want and this is what we don't want, and you're using SECRA, the language, which they understand. And then the third thing is the amendment to the Constitution of New York State that says every citizen has a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. So on that letter that you just got handed, there are 4 chapters where we just selected some relevant information. You can choose to wrap your own language around those examples. Questions?
I just have one comment. It's not a bed of roses here, because I've been hearing from people, and I don't want to put a damper on everything, but some people have, and I've heard this more than once, they would rather have hotels and Airbnbs, because then people will buy the home and live here.
Right. We're trying to control what we can control, and this is what we can control, what we're doing here today. Our elected officials are the ones that have to deal with that other stuff. Joel?
Yeah, you mentioned the public hearing next month. What is this public?
We don't have a date yet.
What is the public hearing on?
Secret.
No. I mean, there is no public hearing at that phase of secret.
It would have to be for the preliminary site plan, is that what?
Yeah. So
That's not a public hearing.
there is supposed to be a scheduled public hearing, either in March or in
It
April.
will be on the planning board agenda and people can speak.
It hasn't.
But that's not a public hearing.
I don't know, I mean, they certainly can hold one. And SECRA also advises municipalities to combine hearings. So if they wanted to get more information about SECRA, and they wanted to also simultaneously have a hearing on the site plan application, they could do it. I mean, I
Yeah,
haven't
but
seen
it hasn't been noticed. I mean,
I haven't seen it noticed.
No, it hasn't been
So there is no
noticed.
scheduled public hearing. People's opportunity would be to come to the planning board or communicate with them via
Yeah.
writing.
So Joel, to your point, the next step, as soon as we hear, because we're monitoring, as soon as this application comes up, we are going to let all of you know that, and and we'll tell you exactly what it is that it's going to be on, and that the more people that are there, that's also another way of having an impact.
Mary, just to clarify.
Could you just stand up and identify yourself?
Just to clarify the letter, I'm gonna write the letter and I'm gonna send it to the town, to the planning department, and I'm gonna send a copy to the Civic Association?
Yes,
Okay, so we're gonna email it to the Civic Association?
yes. Thank you for that clarification.
Okay. Letter be sent by.
So, what we will do is we will keep you posted to remind you of sending the letters. You can start, you go home today, or while you're watching Super Bowl tomorrow, you can write those letters and start sending them in. And we are going to be sending out messaging to you starting Monday. We're going to send the letter out and that piece, you know, the 4 chapters pieces, and we will then send you out the survey as well. And the survey is specifically for the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association, to Doris's point, that is going to help us know, representing you, that we are going to take a position. And then how that would work is we will write a formal letter. We will make a presentation before the governing bodies and tell them that in our position, we have done all of this work and all of this information, and therefore, this is what our community is stating. Did I clearly,
Yes.
yes? All right. Eric.
Mary, real quickly, to summarize, there is no movement to go back to the owner and instead of saying, you know, this process of, on the assumption that most of the input that you get is going to be negative against the project. There's no process, no way to go back to the owner and say, can we talk about different ways that you can use that property, make money, and get community approval? We are beyond that. The train has left the station for that. Is that correct?
I mean, that is, someone can do that if they want to. Right now, we're on this process.
But the Civic Association is not going to do that.
We have not had that in our
Okay.
in our body of work.
Because I'm thinking about the way the hardware business went down. Took a long time, a lot of effort, and eventually didn't satisfy the owner of that property.
Right.
And I don't think the community's better off.
So, Eric, what I hear you saying, and I'm
Okay.
a trained mediator, I am a trained mediator, that would be nice to include in a process, and I think one of the things...
It's just an opportunity. We're all here. There may be people who want to get together and say, hey, could we have a different process instead of the fait accompli, which is, you know, do the right thing, and there are alternatives.
Yes, Eric.
The owner wants to get some money back out of that property.
Jen, stand up so they...
Yeah. Hi, Joel Klein, Mattituck. Well, I just wanted to follow up on that. One of the things that it slipped by me when the developer was here the other night, and I'm sorry I didn't ask him about this. He made a point of saying that the proposal they had done a study, and what they were proposing was the highest and best use for that parcel. What he didn't explain was that was the highest and best use for the applicant to maximize his profits.
Yeah.
And I would have liked to, I'm sorry I didn't think to ask him at the time, well, what were the other possibilities that you ruled out, but which would still have afforded the applicant a reasonable return on his investment. And that can be addressed in the seeker process if you get to the point where you're doing a DEIS as the alternatives under consideration, which is a very important part of the EIS process, as Bob pointed out, and often tends to get neglected.
So Joel, just based on, because you have knowledge, all right? So I'm going to ask Joel a question because he has a professional background. How do you see the community having that input to the boards?
It's, you know, it's really very, very difficult. You should understand the bulk of my experience has been working for developers or for government. And in the case of the government, it's where the government was the developer or the developer was a permitting agency. My experience is broad that way. It's great writing letters. I mean, they always help. But ultimately, in a project like this, it's going to come down to the planning board making a finding. And they have to base that findings on fact. The boards are not democracies. You know, they say, well, we got 2,000 people who are against it and 5 people for it, and therefore we're going to vote it down. That is not sustainable in court. So while there is a real impact, because there is an influence on board members and how they're thinking and, you know, how the community feels, the reality is getting comments in is, I think, most important during the final stage. And you're going to have to comment more than once on this project because of the various stages of the process. And the most important part is probably going to be when the draft environmental impact statement, if there is one, comes out. Because there, the developer has to respond to every single comment that they receive in the final environmental impact statement. And the more specific you can be in your comments, as has been pointed out here, the harder it is for the developer. It's not just enough to say, well, there's going to be traffic. Well, you know, that's sort of obvious. But has the developer adequately evaluated the traffic impact? If you think he hasn't, for whatever reason, that's something you need to put into your comments at that point. It's probably early at this point because, you know, as much as data this developer had, there's still a lot more to be found out. Like, I don't think they know exactly what the nature of the, or extent of the traffic impacts will be at this point. We know they're going to be bad, but just how bad are they going to be? One of the things that's been neglected, and again, Bob touched on this, and Mary as well, is what's called cumulative impact. There's been a tendency in the town of Southold to treat each individual project separately. And I heard our supervisor at one point say, well, every project has had a traffic study. Well, that doesn't help, because if you look at each project in a vacuum, yeah, maybe they can deal with the project. But if you've got 10 projects and they're all coming in within a relatively short period of time, that's a very, very different situation. And that's something also under the SEQA project that needs to be addressed. There's a specific requirement to consider cumulative impact under SEQA. The other thing I just want to point out, it's very, very common for a developer whose environmental consultant comes in with a review document to say, well, we looked at the problem and the issue, and the impacts are not significant, or they're minimal. Well, yeah, who's defining those terms? Maybe to the developer they are. So you need to kind of watch out for that kind of language in anything that the developer says.
So Joel, I'm going to ask you something. And Joel is a member of the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association. He also, on February 27th, the Civic Association is having in Save the Inlet people. So Joel, I'm going to ask you, as we go along this process, would you be willing to be a speaker at some point to what you just addressed that would help the community give that kind of specificness at the juncture
Boy, that's hard to say no to. Let me just go ahead and say, I'm certainly open to it, but it depends on schedule and all.
Oh, of course, of course. But here's what's beautiful about what's happening, and we're gonna wrap up, but here's what's beautiful about what is happening in our community, and it goes back to some of the things, you know, Doris has said, and Eric, and the civic associations from Orient to Laurel have been educating the community, not only bringing in the developer for a project, but bringing in your town representatives, your zoning board of appeals, to find out what does that mean, the planning board, what does that mean, and that this, and Bob DeLuca, a secret expert, and then somebody like Eric, who has an amazing background, who can frame and give language to what the details are in here that the community wants. And then the other thing is, we have a richness of citizens in our community that we can tap for expertise that are willing then to come in and share that with all of us, so that we hold our governing bodies accountable to listening to the voice of the community. Eric?
I just thanked you to Joel, that was so perfectly said, and to Mr. Bergen, who's also spoken to this point. Historically, we have abandoned a rich and detailed language of civic life, really after World War II. We said we're going to do things differently now, and the results are everywhere around us in the built environment. We need to rediscover how to speak about our values as a community, what we want to see in the built environment, and recognize how the built environment and our personal and public lives are interplaying with one another. And part of that homework that you have been given by Mary is to look through the comprehensive plan and plagiarize it. Because it is a lot of work that people did to come up with that language. What is community character? What is rural character? Right? So this isn't an easy task you've been asked to do. But I think there's so much will and so much passion for this place and for each other that it's going to be a really enriching experience. And hopefully
So on that note, will you give a round of applause to our and then to all of you for both coming out on January 30th and to come out on a Saturday for 2 hours. So applause to you. Thank you all. We'll be in touch. Hello, everyone. Mary Eisenstein here, and I'm addressing you to summarize about where are we going from here. On January 30th, the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association invited in the developer for the Mattituck Hotel, which is on the 11.8 acres where the old Capital One headquarters was. We had in attendance over 131 people. So the question is, what do those 131 people do with the information from that program? Well, the Civic Association has put together a process. So on Saturday, February 11th, we had Bob DeLuca, who is with Group for the East End, Al Krupski, a farmer, and our legislator for our county. We had Leslie Weissman, who's the chairperson for the Zoning Board of Appeals, and we had Eric Sepanowski, who is a farmer and on the trustees. They helped with further information to give us all the tools for those next steps. And here are the three citizen tools. The comprehensive plan, which is the roadmap for what we are doing here to plan for the future of South Town. SECRA, which stands for the State Environmental Review Act, which is the citizen tool to help us use and apply to a project such as the Mattituck Hotel. And then finally, the amendment to the New York State Constitution, which says every citizen has the right to clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. So what we have done is we have put together a sample letter for all of our members to send to our board chair, the planning board chair, Don Wilczynski, and the planning director, Heather Lanza. That letter addresses the hotel and then what your thoughts are on that. So our second page to this letter cites examples from 4 chapters in the comprehensive plan. And those 4 chapters give examples, and they are traffic, economic development, water, and community character. And what we've done is highlighted some references from the comprehensive plan for you to look at and to write a letter, whether you are in support of the project or you are against that project. That is up to you. But what's important here is the language that you are going to put in your letter, that you are citing the comprehensive plan. So for an example, under economic development, you can say, I support this project because 50 jobs are going to come as a result of this project. Or, I'm not in support of this project because the scale of it does not fit in our community character. So once you go through that letter, we want you to send it to, the address is on the sample letter. We want you to send it to the board chair and the planning board director. And in addition, we have the Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association's email, and we ask that you send it to us. And in addition, would you please share it with your neighbor? And then what our next steps are, we are going to send out to you a survey, 5 survey questions next week for you to answer. Once we collect all of that data, we are then going to decide, do we take a position based on the information that we have gotten from you, the community? We will then apply the State Environmental Review Act language, which is SECRA, and in addition, the amendment to the Constitution to that body of information that you're sending with us. We will then make the decision whether we are going to take a position on this project. We want to thank all of you for being engaged in this process, because remember, it is incumbent upon us, each of us, to give a voice to shaping the future of our Mattituck-Laurel community, and we do that with being proactive and connected to your Mattituck-Laurel Civic Association. So thank you all so very much. Look forward to seeing you at our next meetings.